Great was the excitement all the week about the repairs in the carriage house, which went briskly on in spite of the incessant questions, advice, and meddling of the boys. Old Gibbs was nearly driven wild with it all, but managed to do his work nevertheless, and by Friday night the place was all in order, roof mended, shelves up, walls whitewashed, a great window cut at the back, which let in a flood of sunshine, and gave them a fine view of the brook, the meadows, and the distant hills, and over the great door, painted in red letters, was the Lawrence Museum. All Saturday morning the boys were planning how it should be furnished with their spoils, and when Mr. Lorry arrived, bringing an aquarium, which Mrs. Amy said she was tired of, their rapture was great. The afternoon was spent in arranging things, and when the running and lugging and hammering was over, the ladies were invited to behold the institution. It certainly was a pleasant place, airy, clean, and bright. A hop vine shook its green bells round the open window. The pretty aquarium stood in the middle of the room, with some delicate water plants rising above the water, and goldfish showing their brightness as they floated to and fro below. On either side of the window were rows of shelves, ready to receive the curiosities yet to be found. Dan's tall cabinet stood before the great door, which was fastened up, while the small door was to be used. On the cabinet stood a queer Indian idol, very ugly but very interesting. Old Mr. Lawrence sent it, as well as a fine Chinese junk in full sail, which had a conspicuous place on the long table in the middle of the room. Above, swinging in a loop and looking as if she was alive, hung Polly, who died at an advanced age, had been carefully stuffed, and was now presented by Mrs. Joe. The walls were decorated with all sorts of things: a snake's skin, a big wasp's nest, a birch bark canoe, a string of birds' eggs, wreaths of gray moss from the south, and a bunch of cotton pods. The dead bats had a place, also a large turtle shell, and an ostrich egg proudly presented by Demi, who volunteered to explain these rare curiosities to guests whenever they liked. There were so many stones that it was impossible to accept them all, so only a few of the best were arranged among the shells on the shelves. The rest were piled up in corners to be examined by Dan at his leisure. Everyone was eager to give something, even Silas, who sent home for a stuffed wildcat killed in his youth. It was rather moth-eaten and shabby, but on a high bracket and best side foremost the effect was fine, for the yellow glass eyes glared and the mouth snarled so naturally that Teddy shook in his little shoes at sight of it when he came bringing his most cherished treasure, one cocoon, to lay upon the shrine of science. "Isn't it beautiful? I'd no idea we had so many curious things. I gave that. Don't it look well? We might make a lot by charging something for letting folks see it." Jack added that last suggestion to the general chatter that went on as the family viewed the room. "This is a free museum, and if there is any speculating on it, I'll paint out the name over the door," said Mr. Lorry, turning so quickly that Jack wished he had held his tongue. "Hear, hear," cried Mr. Bear. "Speech, speech," added Mrs. Joe. "Can't. I'm too bashful. You give them a lecture yourself. You are used to it," Mr. Lorry answered, retreating towards the window, meaning to escape, but she held him fast, and said, laughing as she looked at the dozen pairs of dirty hands about her, "If I did lecture, it would be on the chemical and cleansing properties of soap. Come now, as the founder of the institution, you really ought to give us a few moral remarks, and then we will applaud tremendously." Seeing that there was no way of escaping, Mr. Lorry looked up at Polly hanging overhead, seemed to find inspiration in the brilliant old bird, and sitting down upon the table, said in his pleasant way, "There is one thing I'd like to suggest, boys, and that is, I want you to get some good as well as much pleasure out of this. Just putting curious or pretty things here won't do it, So suppose you read up about them, so that when anybody asks questions, you can answer them and understand the matter. I used to like these things myself, and should enjoy hearing about them now, for I've forgotten all I once knew. It wasn't much, was it, Joe? Here's Dan now, full of stories about birds and bugs and so on. Let him take care of the museum, and once a week the rest of you take turns to read a composition or tell about some animal, mineral, or vegetable. We should all like that, and I think it would put considerable useful knowledge into our heads. What do you say, Professor? I'd like it much, and will give the lads all the help I can. But they will need books to read up these new subjects, and we have not many, I fear, began Mr. Bear, looking much pleased and planning many fine lectures on geology, which he liked. We should have a library for the special purpose. Is that a useful sort of book, Dan? Asked Mr. Lorry, pointing to the volume that lay open by the cabinet. Oh, yes. It tells all I want to know about insects. I had it here to see how to fix the butterflies right. I covered it so it is not hurt, and Dan caught it up, fearing the lender might think him careless. Give it here a minute. And, pulling out his pencil, Mr. Lorry wrote Dan's name in it, saying, as he set the book up on one of the corner shelves, where nothing stood but a stuffed bird without a tail, "There, that is the beginning of the museum library. I'll hunt up some more books, and Demi shall keep them in order. Where are those jolly little books we used to read, Joe? Insect Architecture or some such name, all about ants having battles and bees having queens and crickets eating holes in our clothes and stealing milk and larks of that sort." In the garret at home. I'll have them sent out, and we will plunge into natural history with a will, said Mrs. Joe, ready for anything. Won't it be hard to write about such things? Asked Nat, who hated compositions. At first, perhaps, but you will soon like it. If you think that hard, how would you like to have this subject given to you as it was to a girl of 13? A conversation between Themistocles, Aristides, and Pericles on the proposed appropriation of the funds of the Confederacy of Delos for the ornamentation of Athens, said Mrs. Joe. The boys groaned at the mere sound of the long names, and the gentlemen laughed at the absurdity of the lesson. Did she write it? Asked Demi in an awe-stricken tone. Yes, but you can imagine what a piece of work she made of it, though she was rather a bright child. I'd like to have seen it, said Mr. Bear. Perhaps I can find it for you. I went to school with her. And Mrs. Joe looked so wicked that everyone knew who the little girl was. Hearing of this fearful subject for a composition quite reconciled the boys to the thought of writing about familiar things. Wednesday afternoon was appointed for the lectures, as they preferred to call them, for some chose to talk instead of write. Mr. Bear promised a portfolio in which the written productions should be kept, and Mrs. Bear said she would attend the course with great pleasure. Then the dirty-handed society went off to wash, followed by the professor, trying to calm the anxiety of Rob, who had been told by Tommy that all water was full of invisible pollywogs. I like your plan very much, only don't be too generous, Teddy, said Mrs. Bear when they were left alone. You know most of the boys have got to paddle their own canoes when they leave us, and too much sitting in the lap of luxury will unfit them for it. I'll be moderate, but do let me amuse myself. I get desperately tired of business sometimes, and nothing freshens me up like a good frolic with your boys. I like that Dan very much, Joe. He isn't demonstrative, but he has the eye of a hawk, and when you have tamed him a little, he will do you credit. I'm so glad you think so. Thank you very much for your kindness to him, especially for this museum affair. It will keep him happy while he is lame. Give me a chance to soften and smooth this poor, rough lad, and make him love us. What did inspire you with such a beautiful, helpful idea, Teddy? Asked Mrs. Bear, glancing back at the pleasant room as she turned to leave it. Laurie took both her hands in his and answered with a look that made her eyes fill with happy tears. Dear Joe, I have known what it is to be a motherless boy. and I never can forget how much you and yours have done for me all these years.